April 11th, 1970. Three men are strapped into a tin can on top of a rocket loaded with enough fuel to level a city, and they're about to fly 250,000 miles from home. 2 days later, one of them will radio back to Earth with a sentence that becomes one of the most famous lines in American history. But here's what nobody tells you about that moment. It wasn't the explosion that almost killed them. It was everything that came after. The cold, the silence, the math that had to work perfectly, or three families would bury empty caskets. This is the story of Jim Lovell, Jack Swigert, and Fred Hayes. And by the end of this video, you're going to understand why NASA still calls this their finest hour, even though it was supposed to be their third moon landing, and it turned into something else entirely. Jim Lovell wasn't supposed to be surprised by space anymore. By 1970, he'd already flown to the moon once, on Apollo 8, close enough to see its gray surface roll beneath him without ever touching down. He'd circled it, photographed it, read from the book of Genesis to a television audience of nearly 1 billion people on Christmas Eve, and come home a hero. Now he was 42 years old, a Navy test pilot who'd survived things that killed other men, and he was finally getting his shot to walk on the surface he'd only been allowed to look at before. Apollo 13 was going to be his moon landing, his footprints, his moment. Fred Hayes was the rookie of the crew, 36 years old, a former Marine and test pilot with a quiet, steady confidence that made him the guy everyone wanted next to them in a crisis, even though nobody knew yet just how true that would turn out to be. He'd trained for years for this exact mission, memorizing every system on the lunar module like it was a second language, because he was the one scheduled to walk on the moon alongside Lovell. And then there was Jack Swigert, 38, sharp, funny, a bachelor with a reputation for enjoying life outside the cockpit as much as inside it. But here's the thing about Swigert. He wasn't even supposed to be on this flight. He was a backup. Days before launch, the original command module pilot, Ken Mattingly, was pulled from the mission after doctors discovered he'd been exposed to German measles and had no immunity. Swigert got the call that changed everything. Just 72 hours to prepare for a trip to the moon. Imagine getting that phone call. Your entire life rearranges itself in an instant, and suddenly you're not a backup anymore. You're going. None of them knew it yet, but that swap, that last-minute, almost bureaucratic decision, would end up being one of the strange twists of fate that determined who lived and who didn't have to find out what almost happened. April 11th, 1970, 1:13 in the afternoon, Kennedy Space Center. The Saturn V rocket ignites beneath them, 7.5 million pounds of thrust tearing through the Florida air, and the three men are pinned back into their seats as 363 feet of American engineering claws its way into the sky. Even the launch wasn't clean. 2 minutes in, one of the second stage engines cuts off 5 minutes early, an alarming shudder running through the vehicle, but the other engines compensate and the ship keeps climbing. It's a warning nobody fully registers yet, a whisper before the shout. For the next 2 days, everything goes almost boringly right. That's the word the crew actually used later. Boring. They coast through the vacuum of space, running system checks, doing television broadcasts back to Earth that almost nobody watches, because by 1970 the American public had already started to lose interest in moon missions. Going to the moon had somehow become routine. The three astronauts even joke about it on the broadcast, showing off their weightlessness, floating a camera through the cabin, trying to make people care again. Down on Earth, the networks don't even air it live. Nobody watching, nobody paying attention, and 200,000 miles from home, something inside their spacecraft is quietly, invisibly failing. April 13th, 1970, 9:53 at night, Houston time. The crew has just finished another television broadcast, and Mission Control has asked for a routine procedure. Stir the oxygen tanks in the service module, a simple fan and heater cycle meant to keep the liquid oxygen from settling unevenly inside the tanks. Swigert flips the switch, and then the spacecraft slams sideways. A bang rips through the cabin, sharp and violent, like something has physically struck the ship. Lights flicker, warning indicators bloom across the control panel all at once. A wall of red and amber that shouldn't be possible, that no single failure should be able to trigger. Lovell later says it felt like the whole vehicle shuddered, like they'd been hit by something out there in the dark. For one disorienting second, nobody in that capsule knows if they're about to die. Swigert keys the radio. His voice, when you listen to the actual recording, isn't panicked. It's tight, controlled, the voice of a man trained to sound calm even when his hands might be shaking. "Okay, Houston, we've had a problem here." Down in mission control, the response is almost dismissive at first, a request to repeat the message because surely, this isn't what it sounds like. Lovell repeats it himself, more precisely this time. "Houston, we've had a problem." That line would get slightly rewritten by Hollywood decades later into "Houston, we have a problem," and it's the version everyone remembers. But the real moment, the actual recording, is somehow more chilling in its restraint. Three men in a metal capsule, hemorrhaging oxygen into the vacuum of space, and the loudest word in the sentence is problem. What none of them know yet, what will take agonizing minutes to piece together, is that oxygen tank number 2 has just exploded. A damaged wire inside the tank, insulation worn away years earlier during a ground test nobody caught, sparked when Swigert flipped that routine switch. The explosion didn't just cripple one tank, it blew off an entire panel on the side of the service module and crippled the second oxygen tank right next to it too. Within minutes, both tanks are venting their contents into space. Lovell looks out the window and sees it with his own eyes, a pale cloud of gas billowing away from his spacecraft, drifting into the blackness. It's oxygen, their oxygen, the exact thing 3 human beings need to breathe 200,000 miles from the nearest hospital, the nearest ambulance, the nearest breath of unpressurized air, and it's leaking away in front of him like smoke from a chimney. Here's what almost nobody outside NASA understood at the time. It wasn't just about breathing. The command module, the main spacecraft they lived and traveled in, ran almost everything off those fuel cells, which needed oxygen to generate electricity. Without oxygen, there's no power. Without power, there's no way to fire the engines, no way to navigate, no way to talk to Earth, no way to come home. Within about 3 hours, the crew and mission control both reached the same horrifying conclusion. The command module, the ship built to survive the entire mission, including the fiery return through Earth's atmosphere, is dying. It has minutes of usable power left. If they don't do something, they'll lose everything before they even have a chance to figure out how to get home. So they make a decision that had never been part of any plan, any simulation, any contingency drawn up on paper. They use the lunar module, the small, fragile spacecraft designed to carry 2 men down to the moon's surface for a couple of days, as a lifeboat for 3 men for 4 days, through the freezing vacuum of deep space. Think about what that actually means. The lunar module wasn't built for this. It wasn't built to shield 3 people from cosmic radiation for that long. It wasn't built to scrub the carbon dioxide out of 3 sets of lungs instead of 2. It wasn't built to survive re-entry. It wasn't even built to survive an atmosphere at all. It was a machine meant to die on the lunar surface surface or burn up on its own after use, and now it was the only thing standing between three astronauts and the vacuum of space. Fred Hayes and Jim Lovell scramble through the narrow tunnel connecting the two spacecraft, powering up the lunar module's systems from cold, while Swigert works to shut down the dying command module and preserve just enough power in its batteries for the one thing it would still need to do: survive re-entry days later, after everything else was over. And then the cold sets in. To conserve every scrap of power, Mission Control instructs the crew to shut down almost every system that generates heat. The temperature inside the spacecraft begins to drop, and it doesn't stop dropping. It falls to somewhere near freezing. Condensation beads on the walls, on the instrument panels, on the windows. The astronauts' breath fogs in front of their faces. They can't sleep because the cold won't let them, curling up in whatever corner offers a little relief, wearing every piece of clothing they packed for a moon landing, never a survival mission. Fred Hayes develops a kidney infection and a fever in that freezing capsule, shivering and sick, 200,000 miles from the nearest doctor, and there's nothing anyone can do about it except keep flying and hope his body holds on. And then there's the air itself. As the three men breathe inside that cramped lunar module, they're producing carbon dioxide, and the lunar module's air scrubbers, the canisters designed to absorb that carbon dioxide and keep the air breathable, were built for 2 men on a 2-day trip, not 3 men on a 4-day journey home. The carbon dioxide levels begin climbing toward dangerous territory, an invisible poison building silently in the air they're all sharing, and if nobody solves it, the astronauts will slowly lose consciousness and never wake up, suffocating quietly inside a ship that never even ran out of oxygen. Here's where the story stops being about 3 men in space and becomes about hundreds of people on the ground refusing to let them die. Engineers at Mission Control, men who had spent years building spacecraft with unlimited budgets and clean laboratories, are handed an impossible puzzle. The command module has square air filter canisters. The lunar module needs round ones, different shapes, different sockets, completely incompatible systems. And somewhere in Houston, a group of engineers locks itself in a room with exactly the same materials the astronauts have on board, no more, no less, and starts building a fix using duct tape, plastic bags, cardboard from a procedure manual, and a sock. That's it. That's the whole inventory. A jury-rigged adapter cobbled together on a table in Texas, then read up to the crew step by step over the radio, so 3 exhausted, freezing, terrified men could build the same device with their own hands using scraps floating around their cabin. It works. The carbon dioxide levels drop. One crisis solved out of what feels like an endless list still waiting, because power is still disappearing. Every single system draws electricity from a battery supply that was never meant to support this journey, and Mission Control has to calculate second by second exactly how much power they can spare for anything, for lights, for the tiny amount of heat they allow, for the guidance computer they need to fire the engines and correct their course. At one point, the astronauts are told to power down the guidance computer completely to save energy, meaning they have to steer the spacecraft using nothing but a window, a fixed star, and Lovell's own eyes and instincts, a level of manual precision that leaves almost no room for a mistake out here in the freezing dark, with no rescue possible if something goes wrong back on Earth. This isn't just a NASA story anymore. It's on every television, every newspaper, Every dinner table in America and around the world, the same public that had shrugged off a routine moon mission days earlier, is now glued to their sets, praying for three men they'd almost forgotten were even up there. Churches hold special services. Strangers stop each other on the street to ask if there's any news. For 4 days, the entire world holds its breath together. Every course correction the crew makes has to be nearly perfect, because there's no room for error and no fuel to spare for a second attempt. They fire the lunar module's engine, a system never designed to serve as the primary propulsion for the entire spacecraft, to bend their trajectory and slingshot around the far side of the moon, using its gravity to fling them back toward Earth instead of landing on it. Lovell becomes the first human being to travel to the moon twice and touch neither time, watching that gray surface drift past his window again, closer than almost any human being alive has ever been, and still forced to leave it behind. As they finally approach Earth, a new terror waits for them. They have to jettison the crippled service module, and for the first time, the crew and the world get a real look at the damage. An entire panel is torn away, wires and insulation exposed to space, a gaping wound in the side of their spacecraft. Lovell radios down what he sees, and even the engineers on the ground, who have spent 4 days calculating and recalculating survival odds, go quiet at how much worse it looks than they imagined. It's genuinely stunning that the explosion didn't kill them outright in that first instant. Then comes the coldest, cruelest twist of the entire mission. They have to power the command module back up, the same one Swigert had shut down days earlier to save its batteries, and pray that 4 days of freezing temperatures and condensation haven't shorted out anything critical. Nobody has ever powered a spacecraft back up from this kind of cold soak before. There's no manual for it, there's no data, there's just hope and careful engineering, and a sequence of switches flipped one at a time while an entire country listens in. It works, and then comes re-entry itself, the searing, radio blackout minutes, where the capsule plunges through Earth's atmosphere, wrapped in a shroud of superheated plasma, when all communication cuts off completely, and nobody on the ground can know if the astronauts are alive or already gone. Normal re-entry blackouts last about 3 minutes. This one stretches past 4, then past 4.5. Mission Control sits in silence, watching a clock, waiting for a voice that might never come. And then, finally, the crackle of static breaks through, and Swigert's voice comes back on the line. 3 parachutes bloom against the sky over the Pacific Ocean on April 17th, 1970, and the command module Odyssey splashes down, battered, freezing, but carrying all 3 men home alive. Jim Lovell, Fred Hayes, Jack Swigert. A mission that was supposed to land 2 men on the moon instead became the story of an entire team of human beings in space and on the ground, refusing to let 3 of their own die 200,000 miles from home. NASA would later call Apollo 13 a successful failure, and that phrase has never really left the public imagination since. They never touched the lunar surface, but what they proved instead might matter more, that when everything goes wrong, when the plan collapses and the machines fail, and the cold creeps in and the air turns dangerous, human beings can still find a way to bring each other home. If this story hit you the way it hit us putting it together, do us a favor. Drop a comment telling us which moment gave you chills, hit that like button, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next story like this one. We've got a lot more where this came from.